I suppose we can start without my one of my co-organizers, Nathalie Collet. Hello everybody. I'm happy to see so many of you here today, students and colleagues, and also those I can't see but I know are online. I just wanted to tell people who are online, please turn your microphones off. We've heard many domestic disputes, so just because people forgot to mute their microphone, so please do so. So welcome to this seminar dedicated to Jan Carson's fiction, the production, illustration, translation, publishing and reception of her literary work as announced on the program. And the idea behind this seminar, organized for our research lab IDEA, Interdisciplinarité dans les études anglophones, and the project Text and Book Itineraries that Nathalie Collet, who is not here now, and I co-pilot, was to cover the aspects of the whole chain from the author's production of her text to the reception of her books by critics and the public. And these research preoccupations resonate with our master's degree students program and their interest in the materiality of texts and books. And of course, we organized this seminar with them in mind. So first and foremost, I would like to thank Jan for being here today, available so early to discuss her work with us, despite her busy timetable as an author in residence. And we make her work hard, and I apologize for that. Many thanks to our guests from France and abroad for coming to Nancy. Here is Nathalie. So Nathalie is my colleague, and together we pilot the project Text and Book Itineraries, and she's also Directrice IDEA. So welcome. John, welcome. So many thanks to our guests from France and abroad for coming to Nancy to meet the author in person and talk about their different forms of collaboration with Jan, or about their academic work on Jan's fiction. Jan's fiction, especially the postcard stories, the fire starters, the raptures, Malcolm Orange Disappears, as you can see from the program. And I would like to thank the three students who are part of the Théâtre Universitaire de Nancy, Myriam, Lucie and Titouan, for reading Jan's short story, A Glorified Hill. And the performance, as you can see from the program, is scheduled at 5 o'clock this afternoon. And it will be a surprise even for me. And I would like to thank my co-organizers and my little helpers, Alicia and Pauline. Pauline, who designed this program and the poster today, and also Dorian, and also the Ariel interns, Leah and Pauline. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them. And also they are going to introduce the speakers today. And I would like to thank Sylvie, our secretary, for all the practical arrangements around this seminar. And speaking about practical arrangements, lunch will be served in A157. It's in this building, on this floor. Follow the girls, they know. And dinner tonight for the guests will be at Le Thème. It's in Grande Rue. You have here a map, but also in the bags Dorian gave you, you have a map of Nancy. So if you don't know where the street is, ask the girls. I would also like to thank our sponsors, of course, and you can see them listed here: Université de Lorraine, IDEA, the Embassy of Ireland in Paris, Sofair, Cresib, and all the other sponsors who are financing the Ariel program and Jan's residency. So thank you. So let's start, but before that I would like to add a few words for our students. I don't know if you realize how lucky you are today to be able to listen to Jan, the writer, but also her French editor, Sabine, two of her translators, yes, Dominique and Clara, all these book professionals and also academics who interpret Jan's work from different perspectives. And even Philippe Claudel last night at the Old Du Livre said it was very rare to be able to gather all these people together in the same room at the same time to make them dialogue together and exchange with the audience. So please don't hesitate to ask questions to Jan and to our speakers today, to interact with them, and after their presentation, during coffee breaks. And Jan is always eager to share her ideas and experience, and she's always keen to make new friends, isn't it? So I'm sure it will be a rich and fruitful seminar, and I'm looking forward to listening to everyone. And now Dorian is going to introduce our special guest, our author in residence, Jan Carson.
Okay, so Jan Carson is a writer and community arts facilitator based in Belfast. She specializes in engagement with older people. She has published 3 novels, 2 collections of microfiction, and 2 short story collections. Her novel, The Firestarters, won the European Union Prize for Literature for Ireland in 2019. Jan also won the Harper's Bazaar Short Story Competition and was shortlisted for the BBC National Short Story Award and an Unpost Irish Short Story of the Year. Her work has been translated into multiple languages. Jan's latest novel, The Raptures, was published by Doubleday in early 2022. Today, the title of our presentation is Process, Practice, and Preoccupations. Please give a warm welcome to Jan.
Hi folks, it's really lovely to be here. I'm going to let my glamorous assistant put up my PowerPoint for me. And I'm really glad that Monica said about coming and saying hello. I know some of you, we can look up at the front and think that we're all very scary here and that we know what we're doing and we're super professional. That's what we're trying to look like. Mm-hmm. We're still learning as well, and we absolutely love to get to chat to other people who are interested in what we love, which is basically books. So if you are interested in writing or publishing or writing about books or publishing books or any of that stuff, today is a great opportunity to come and chat to some of us. And we're not scary at all. We will talk back. So I am going to spend just about 45 minutes with you to begin with. I should stand at the microphone so everyone can hear. I'm going to spend about 45 minutes telling you a little bit about my kind of journey, some of the themes that come up in my work, and some of the things that have influenced me. If we have time, I might read a little bit as well. We'll see how it goes. When I get excited, I tend to talk a lot, so the time might go very quickly. And I also know it's 9 o'clock on a Friday morning. Some of you might be a little bit sleepy. So I've got plenty of pictures to show you as well. I'm going to grab my books here. Okay, so I'm going to begin with a very quick kind of rocket through how I became a writer, because some of you might be thinking about that as a career. This is a process. So I was one of those kids that loved to read. And one of my most kind of defining memories was my mother on a Wednesday night. She used to get the grocery shopping, and she was a very lazy mother in the 1980s. She used to abandon me in the library, and that was a really dangerous thing to do because I started to read. And I started to read children's books, and by the time I was 8, I'd read all of the children's books in Ballymena Library that I was interested in, and I moved on to crime fiction, which probably wasn't appropriate for an 8-year-old. But I fell in love with Agatha Christie and Stephen King and all sorts of great writers. And very early on, I wanted to learn, how do you do that with words? Because I grew up in Northern Ireland in the middle of the Troubles, and it wasn't a particularly nice or pleasant place to grow up. It was quite scary. And yet when I opened a book, I discovered that I could go to a different place. I could go to Narnia. I could go to a creepy house where Agatha Christie was murdering everyone, and I could escape for a while. And I wanted to learn, how do you do that? How do you make people feel with words? But I was really scared. I also grew up in a very religious home, and in our house, art wasn't something that you did. We weren't allowed to go to the cinema. We weren't allowed to drink. We weren't allowed to dance. And the idea that for my job, might want to be an artist that wasn't on the table at all. So for a long time, I didn't write. A really long time. I read as much as I could, but I didn't write anything. I went to Queen's University, which is this beautiful building, very similar to your own university, as you can see, where I studied literature when I was 18, but I didn't write anything. When I was 25, I decided I needed to get out of Northern Ireland. Growing up in Northern Ireland is like growing up in a goldfish bowl. It's so small that everybody knows each other, and it's really hard to get away from someone who doesn't know your parents and might report back on you. So I decided I would get as far as possible away, and I moved to the other side of the world, to Portland in Oregon, which is a really cool city, and it's a very arty city. And I realized that I had a chance. I had a chance to actually do what I wanted to do with my life. So when I get off on the plane in Portland, not knowing anyone, I told a massive lie. I started telling people, I'm a writer. I'm actually quite a big deal in Ireland. And I hadn't written anything. But people began to ask to read my work, and I had to start writing really quickly. So I stayed in Portland for 4 years, but those first 2 years were incredibly important for me. I wrote every day, sometimes for 6 hours, drank a lot of wine, drank a lot of coffee, and I wrote. And I met other writers, and I went to readings, and that's where I became a writer. And I always tell this anecdote because, do you know what? If you're a writer or an artist or a musician today, the world is not waiting for your book. No one is going to tap you on the shoulder and go, Clara, where's that novel? Everyone wants to read it. You have to get to a point where you actually motivate yourself. And for me, it was this. It was moving to the other side of the world. Portland was super important for me. Best bookstore in the world, Powell's City of Books. It's an entire block of books. Very exciting. I got to meet or listen to some writers that I absolutely love, people like Salman Rushdie and Douglas Copeland and Jonathan Safran Foer and Patti Smith, and I learnt so much. And I also learnt about community. I met other artists, and I learnt how artists feed off each other and support each other and give each other ideas. So it was such an informative place for me. And then a disaster happened. I lost my work visa. And I had to move home. And I didn't just have to move home. I had to move into my parents' house, back into the bedroom that I had grown up in, that still had the same duvet cover that I had when I was 10. And I was 30 years old, and it was really humiliating. I got a job in a shopping mall. Worst job I have ever had. I used to cry on the way to work in the morning. But that was also a very important experience for me because I had no distractions for a year. I went to work from 9 to 5, and then I wrote. And I wrote in my lunch breaks. This, you can't see it, the little black thing in the middle is the coffee island. That's where I wrote my first book. So in the half-hour lunch break that I got every day, I wrote my novel in a year. And it was difficult, but by the end of that year, I had a manuscript. And then I signed my first contract. I went to a wedding, and I got into chat with another lady who was at the wedding, and she worked for a publisher, and she said, let me see your manuscript, and I sent it to her, and that's how I got signed. And I tell you that because there are lots of traditional ways to get published. You can apply for an agent. I have a fantastic agent now. You can send your manuscripts to publishers. But you also have to be ready to grab all the opportunities that come your way. And sometimes you will bump into a lady at a wedding in the queue for the ice cream. And you'll get a chance to say, I'm a writer and you're a publisher. Maybe we should talk. So make sure that you're taking all of those opportunities and grabbing them and really using them. The next, that was in 2014. So it's been... My maths is terrible. It's been quite some time since then. And I have published 7 books in the last, since 2014 was my first. So 7 books in the last 8 years. And I've also edited a collection of other people's stories. You can kind of look on this slide, the progress of how tired I am getting. I get older and more tired as each book comes out, but it's been a wonderful journey. And for me, the last few years have been particularly great because my novel, The Firestarters, in 2019, it won the EU Prize for Literature for Ireland, which is a huge honour. And a responsibility that I take very seriously to be a laureate for European fiction, particularly in the light of Northern Ireland, being caught up in Brexit. So I'm a British citizen as well as having an Irish passport. It's very complicated being Northern Irish. And with my British passport, we've left the EU, and yet I'm an EU laureate. And I get to travel around Europe and meet my colleagues who are writing in different places and learn from them. It's incredibly humbling to spend time with other writers who've grown up in conflict situations like Bosnia and Syria and Ukraine, and to see what they're writing and to see how they're engaging with their story. And I think it's a really helpful thing for me to be able to share a little bit of Northern Ireland's story as well. So I take my responsibilities very seriously, and I'm very grateful for them. I'm grateful also for the translations that have come from this prize. So The Firestarters is currently, I think, scheduled for 12 European languages to be translated into. And The Raptures, my following novel, I think we're at 3 at the minute. And we also have a TV adaptation in process of The Firestarters, working with the BBC, and a film adaptation for cinema of The Raptures. So a lot has happened in a very short space of time. I thought it might be interesting to tell you a little bit about how I write. It's always fascinating to kind of look at writers and think, what do they actually do all day? Do they just sit around having important thoughts, or is there an actual process to what they do? This is my very messy desk that you can see here. Oh, I'm sorry, it's clipped off a little bit. Anyway, you can imagine, there's my very messy desk, and I am a messy writer. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do each day, and I'll also tell you about the actual kind of structure of how I write. So I used to tell people that I was obsessed with characters, that the character always came first in my writing, and to some extent that is true. But I've realised in the last sort of 3 years it's not entirely honest. What I usually begin with is a concept, a kind of little nugget of an idea. And as I mentioned earlier, I was raised in a very religious home, so my primary storytelling text is the Bible. And I'm particularly drawn to parables. A lot of Jesus's teaching was using these kind of little stories to illustrate a truth. And I often start with, okay, I have the truth, the idea that I want to get across. What is going to be the kind of story that I use to get that truth across? And then the characters begin to come in. So for me, the characters are kind of the vehicles that tell the story. So I'm going to illustrate that by reading you a very, very short story here to tell you how that actually works in practice. This is from Postcard Stories, and it's a short story that I'm going to read called Egg. It's really, really tiny. You see it's just this size. I'll read it to you, and then I'll tell you kind of the kind of genesis of where this story came from, so you can understand the process a little. You were born with a bird's egg grasped firmly in your right hand. It wasn't big enough to be a chicken's. It was pale blue with freckles like the eggs you sometimes come across in woodland nests. You don't remember being born with a bird's egg in your fist, or how it got there, why it hadn't cracked under the pressure of your fingers or the force of being born. It is a mystery to you, like breathing or knowing a thing you have not been told. After you were born, they took the bird's egg out of your hand and kept it for days under a heat lamp, but it did not hatch. Eventually they opened it, cracked its thin shell against a spoon and tipped it, yolk and all, into a teacup. There was a little dot, like the red of an eye in photographs. It was swimming in the yolk. It looked up at them and did not blink. Why would it? So there you newly were, with an egg in your hand, with an eye in this egg, like a set of Russian dolls, or how we all are, secretly inside. And I started that around the time that I wrote this story in 2015. I had a lot of friends who were going through fertility treatments for babies. And a lot of them had had a child and were obsessed with having more children. And particularly a couple of friends. I had 2 different friends who had adopted really wonderful children, but couldn't get over the fact that they needed to keep trying for another baby. And I wanted to write something that would illustrate that. And in the longer version of this, it's actually told from the perspective of the mother who has this baby with a bird's egg in its fist and loses the entire first 3 years of that child's life as she's frantically watching the egg, hoping that it will hatch. So that's kind of how I work. I'll start with an idea I want to talk about infertility, and then I will try and find a kind of illustration, something a little story that could be used as the vehicle to tell that. As I mentioned, the next thing that comes after that is characters, and I really love characters. To be honest, they're probably my very favourite thing about writing, getting to make up these people who didn't exist before I started. For me, I spend a lot of time researching my characters. And by research, I don't mean doing any background reading or anything. I mean having conversations with them. So a character for me is usually about a year up here in my head before I start to write anything about them. This is the coffee shop that I write in Belfast down at the bottom here. If you look really closely, you'll see that there's 2 windows on either side of it, and it looks over C.S. Lewis Square, which is a kind of place where people hang out and meet up in Belfast. The reason that I sit there is that I like to watch to get ideas for people. You might sometimes hear we've got Vincent and Ben here with us today, and both are illustrators. And I know I chatted to Vincent last night that he doesn't like to work from photographs. He likes to watch actual people when he's working on his art. I'm the same when I'm writing. If I'm going to write characters, I need to be watching people, how their faces go when they're concentrating, what they look like when they're angry, how they walk across a room. And so a lot of my research for characters is done looking at people in Belfast. Sometimes I walk around. I've got a big anorak with a hood, and I walk about in the rain and I stare at people and I listen to conversations at the bus stop, and I pull all of it together in my characters. And I will not start to write a book until the characters feel real to me. Anything that I've done where I've started to write too early has felt really flat, like the characters are not believable. It's only at that, and writers say this a lot, the kind of point where the characters start talking to you, often not telling you what they want to do. It's more likely they'll tell you what they don't want to do, or what they wouldn't say, or how they wouldn't react. That's the point that I know these characters feel real. It's ready to start writing the book. For the raptures, I actually took it a little bit too far. So there were originally 13 dead children in this. There are now only 11, so it's slightly less traumatic. But before I wrote it, I wrote a short story about every single one of the characters in this book. So it took me 6 months to write the short stories. But by the time I sat down to write the novel, I felt like the characters were really real. I knew who they were, I knew how they were going to react. And bizarrely, it was quite an easy book to write because of that. So characters are important for me. Routine is also really important. I am not very good at night. After it gets to about 8 o'clock in the evening, I start to, and I don't make much sense. So I have learned the hard way that the point of the day between about 10 o'clock and 1 o'clock is when I'm most awake and most creative. So I have a routine at home. I get up, I have my breakfast, I walk to my coffee shop, and I write for about 3 hours, mostly each day. And in 2 to 3 hours, I can usually write about 1,000 words. And then I leave it and I think about those 1,000 words for the rest of the day. So when I come back the following morning, I'm ready to add something on to the story. That has been my process for like almost 15 years. And at the minute, I'm really struggling. It's a thing that they don't tell you about publishing. The freest that you will ever be as a writer is before you publish any book. You can write whatever you want. There's no expectations. There's nobody demanding interviews or evaluation forms or invoices or come to my book festival. So you're very free. As soon as you start to publish, you begin to have to do the rounds of publicising your work. And that is a job in itself. So with the Firestarters, I've done 650 public events with the Firestarters since it came out in 2019. I have worked with, I think there's about 3 dozen academics working on my work at the minute. So you have to give them time for interviews. I do a lot of teaching. So it's all of that is dragging you away from actually being at the computer writing. And I've started to adopt a slightly different routine where I've become one of those writers who disappears for a month. I will go off to the country and sometimes stay literally once I stayed in a cabin in a field in the middle of Scotland where there was nothing but a Highland cow to keep me company. And I write very intensely for a month. It's not my favourite way to do it. Writing for me, it's both a job and the thing that keeps me sane. And I get very, very grumpy when I'm not writing every day. So the routine thing, if you can hold on to it, I think is incredibly important for writers. Okay. To jump on a little bit, I want to talk about practice. And this is a little bit of the kind of things that have influenced me and my work over the last few years. So I come from a very strong literary tradition. In Northern Ireland, you get to kind of straddle two worlds. So I'm part of the British literary tradition, which I find quite kind of vague and nebulous. I don't know what it means to be a British writer. But when you say the words Irish writer, it conjures up this incredibly rich history of amazing people like Samuel Beckett and Edna O'Brien and Yeats and Bram Stoker, and what a joy to be part of that tradition. But I think there's also a very specific thing about being a Northern Irish writer. And I work within a tradition that encompasses all of these amazing writers. These are the people who have gone before me. We've got Paul Muldoon, Brian Friel, the playwright, my really dear friend Sinead Morrissey, in my opinion, the best Northern Irish poet alive at the minute. C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia Chronicles, he's from Belfast. Down at the bottom, the man in the glasses, grumpy Van Morrison, who I also count as an amazing Northern Irish writer, if a slightly grumpy person. And obviously Seamus Heaney. Those are big steps to fill. And I think there's something about that Northern Irish literary tradition that's been incredibly generous to the writers who came after. I would probably also, if I was updating this slide, I would definitely put Jan Carson up there because he's been massively influential in my work. Heaney was incredibly generous. Heaney was constantly looking to support the writers who were coming after him, the younger emerging writers. And those writers that he supported were people like Jan Carson and Sinead Morrissey. And they, in turn, having been given that legacy of support and encouragement, have turned round to us, the generation that came next, and supported us. And so I feel very, very blessed and lucky to be part of a community that actually is a community. It's not a scene. It's a group of writers who are incredibly intent upon supporting each other and nurturing creativity, and ensuring that the stories of Northern Ireland, which are complex, difficult sometimes, and very diverse, are being heard and are being reworked and reimagined in different ways. So those are the guys who kind of came before me. And these are my contemporaries. And guys, this was actually kind of overwhelming because I started to make a slide with the pictures of all of the people who've published books in Northern Ireland this year, just fiction, and I ran out of space. So about 20 years ago, there were basically 4 novelists working in Northern Ireland: Deirdre Madden, Glenn Patterson, Colin Bateman, and David Park. If I tell you there's almost 20 major novels that were published in Northern Ireland this year alone, that the Irish Book of the Year Awards is next week and half the books on it are from the north, something very exciting is happening in Northern Ireland. And they're not just writing about the Troubles. And they're not just writing about the Troubles in the same kind of masculine, heteronormative, white way. They're exploring all sorts of different angles on what's happening in Northern Ireland. So we hear, he's just escaping off the top there with the glasses. This is my pal Dara McAnulty. Dara published his first book when he was 16. Dara's autistic and he's an environmental activist, and his work looks at the Troubles through the lens of autism and the environment. And he's amazing. He's such an inspiring guy. We have people up there who are looking at gender. We have people who are looking at sexuality, what it's like to be a young person in Northern Ireland. And there's lots of reasons why this has happened, why there's such a, I don't like the word explosion of Northern Ireland Irish writers. It has certain connotations, but there has been an explosion of Northern Irish writing. And for me, the two big things are Anna Burns won the Booker Prize with a book called Milkman about 5 years ago. And for us, it was enormous for two reasons. It's written in the vernacular and it's unapologetic about the language it uses. It's very, very Belfasty and people loved it. I had a really interesting chat with guys in Jaipur in India who absolutely love Milkman. And that's amazing that people on the other side of the world love the language from my city. It's also exploring a teenage girl's perspective on the conflict, and we hadn't heard that before. The stories of the Troubles had mostly been urban, male, white, heteronormative. And Anna really opened something up for us. She was saying, do you know what? All the stories of the Troubles haven't been told yet. There are lots of narratives that haven't been explored. So for myself, with my evangelical Protestant background, that felt like an open door to say, tell your story. Tell it in your own voice. There's room here for everyone. So it's an extremely exciting time to be a Northern Irish writer. There's a verse in the Bible which says, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. And it basically means that, if you've got two people hitting up against each other, you're going to get sharper. That's not a very good translation. I have a theology degree and I still said that. I always think about that verse when I look at these are all my friends. I know all of these people personally really well. If your mates are producing amazing books on a regular annual basis, really gives you a kick up the arse. You cannot sit around. You're really happy for them, but you're also like, I have got to up my game here. So there is something wonderful about having these guys as contemporaries. The other thing that's really informed my work has been looking at dementia. So I am a community arts facilitator, so I've been working with community groups for a very long time, over 20 years now. And in the last 10 years, I have begun to focus my work on engaging with people who have dementia. So I run writing projects and storytelling projects with folks who are in the beginning stages of dementia. Last year, I got to work at Queen's, our university, with a research team who were looking at how dementia is depicted in contemporary fiction. And for me, it was the perfect crossover of looking at an illness that affects so many people and it can be so devastating, and also my own personal practice in terms of language. And I became really, really interested in the linguistic features around dementia and the creative possibility there. So I'll try and explain this very, very briefly. I got really interested in this, and it's very similar to learning a new language. If you begin to lose and forget words, your brain finds other ways to communicate what you want to say. So I first picked up on this when a lady I was working with, she'd forgotten the word for a glass that you put water in. And she said, oh, Jan, can you give me the thing that the wetness goes in? And it's beautiful. It's a much more poetic way of saying glass than saying glass. And I began to play with that, and I've written quite a few pieces looking at a kind of dementia voice. And I actually this year edited a collection of short stories which are all exploring the dementia experience. So there's 14 Irish and British writers in here, and I got to edit it and look very closely at the language associated with dementia. And it brought me back to thinking about sentences. So often poets are very, very focused on how does a sentence sound. George Saunders, the American writer, says a sentence has to sing and also mean, which I think is beautiful. Poets understand that. It must sound good off the page. Sometimes prose writers forget that. So we write to convey narrative, we write to mean. The dementia work really brought me back to thinking about how do we use language creatively? How do we make a sentence sound and flow off the page as well as tell a story? So that has been a huge influence, as has community work. This has been huge. Just meeting people. I write about Belfast. I almost exclusively write about Belfast in Northern Ireland. I know lots of writers can do this, but I can't do this unless I'm actually deeply embedded in the culture and the community of Northern Ireland. And community work allows me to do that on a daily basis. I'm currently, while I'm in Nancy, writing a book which is all set in a community centre, looking at the kind of support groups and programs that run in community centres. But almost every one of my books borrows little bits from the people that I've met through my community work. Folks who've lived through the Troubles, who have seen awful, awful things, who've done awful, awful things, who don't know how to process it. The Firestarters has 2 male characters in it, Jonathan and Sammy's an ex-paramilitary who's exactly like a lot of the men that I've worked with in community work. He doesn't know how to talk about what he's done. And I wanted to read you very quickly. I thought I'd go old school here. This is a passage from a very old story called Dinosaur Act, about a woman who has lost her husband. And her husband is one of these men, the kind of man that I work with all the time in writing groups, who doesn't know how to talk or express his feelings. And this little passage is set at the funeral of her husband, and these men come to pay their respects. In the days following Jim's death, Sandra could see that other people were equally shy of loss. She watched them filing in and out of her front room. She recognised herself in the way that they held their mouths oddly, as if unsure whether to laugh or spit. People who could not fully speak their sympathy baked it into fruit loaves and flake meal biscuits. They left their cake tins without saying in towering stacks on her kitchen counter. Some of them were labelled with handwritten names. Mrs. Adger, Mrs. McEwen, Jim McNeely. Sandra wasn't sure if this meant they wanted their tins back, and if so, how long she should wait after the funeral to return them. There was too much cake for one person, and the freezer was still full from Christmas. Several of Jim's old mates from the shipyards appeared at the wake. Sandra didn't recognise any of them, but every so often recalled a name in passing, the memory of it hooking at her grief as she remembered an anecdote Jim had once passed across their dinner table, easy as a dish of boiled potatoes. They were big men with damp skin and proper suits, kept good for funerals and marching. A fair percentage of them were also called Jim or some clipped version of James. They announced themselves from the hall gruffly as if they'd not yet grown into their names. They refused to sit, even when seats were available. I'm not stopping, love. No tea for myself. I've just risen from a cup. When leaving, they lingered too long in the doorway, holding one of Sandra's hands in 2 of theirs, like they were trying to pray and forgetting the words. When they drew back to leave, as often as not, she'd find a clammy £5 or £20 note marking the place where the 2 of them had met and parted, and in doing so remained just as strange as ever. Sandra would have liked for these men to cry. Every one of them was thick with the need to cry, and not just about Jim, though she could see the yearning just beneath their skin. It was tight and straining like the stretched surface of a blistered heel. There was nothing she could say to provoke it. They were not the kind of men who cried, even over a dead wife, though a child might have been the exception. So you can see there that kind of reluctance to talk about your emotions, and it's something that I encounter a lot in my community work. And finally, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time watching the clock up here so I know where we are, on the 3 main themes that come up in my work repeatedly. I guess when you're 7 books in, you begin to start to notice, to understand yourself, and that you're circling around the same kind of preoccupations over and over again. And I'm not sure if I'm going to write about these things for the rest of my life, but I definitely have at least another 5 books that I want to write about these things. So I'm sorry, you're going to be stuck with these for a little bit longer. The first massive preoccupation is Protestant culture, which is not a very sexy thing to say that you're into. I think the predominant narrative that has come out of Northern Ireland, the one that people know, tends to be the nationalist narrative, mostly because they're the good guys and it was my lot that came in and took the land in the first place. So I often start with having to apologise for, yes, I am a planter, yes. I think when you look through the canon of Northern Irish literature, there's traditionally been a lot more writing from a nationalist perspective, and there are many reasons for that. Some of them are tied into that small snapshot of my own personal experience that I gave you. You know, if you're from a Protestant evangelical background, there's not a lot of room for art or creativity in that world. So those folks who grew up like me in kind of staunch Protestant households, we often weren't encouraged into the arts. That goes some way to explaining the lack. I think a lot of voices have been lost, and I'll introduce you to some in a few minutes. And I also think just there, like as I said, places like the American publishing market have been much quicker to snap up nationalist narratives than the Protestant ones. The 2 things that I'm super interested in terms of Protestant culture are what we would call evangelical Protestant culture. So people who actually have a faith. It's not a religion. It's a belief that actually informs how they vote, how they marry, how they spend their money, how they see the world. People who go to church regularly and worship. That's the world I grew up in. And it's very, very hard to find any of it reflected in the literature. The book in the middle is December Bride, which is by Sam Hannah Bell, and that's the last big book about evangelical Protestantism until we get to the Raptures, which came out this year, and I think it was published in the 1930s. So it's been quite a while since anybody looked at faith culture from a Protestant perspective in Northern Ireland. And I guess for me, growing up, I didn't see my world reflected anywhere in the books that I read. I could have told you exactly what happened at a Catholic mass or a Catholic funeral, but I didn't see any depictions of what happened in the kind of religious services and things that I would have attended every week. And for a young person, that makes you question the validity of your experience. Is it not worth writing about? Is it not interesting enough? And it also means that we can't critique either. So a lot of what I've done, I would call myself a critical friend. I grew up in this world. I'm not an active member of this community anymore, but I have a fondness for it. And so when I write about it, I try to be honest. There are a lot of very problematic things in this world, in this community. They have very bad attitudes towards women. I couldn't have been a leader in this world because I'm a woman. They have desperately troubling attitudes around sexuality and gender, the environment, sectarianism. So there's a lot of bigotry here. There's also a lot of really good stuff. These are very kind people. For the most part, they're people who are loyal and steadfast, and I wanted to write that into my work as well. So I like to explore evangelical Protestant culture. And I also like to explore the kind of signs and symbols of the Protestant culture you might be more familiar with in Northern Ireland. So the orange men, the very shouty politicians that you see on the news all the time, they feature quite heavily in my work as well. The more political aspect of what it means to be a unionist or a loyalist in Northern Ireland. And I am particularly obsessed with the symbols. This is a lambeg drum down here, the loudest acoustic instrument in the world. And just if you see one of those, you just want to write stories about it straight away because there's so much potential in that. So Protestant culture, and it's in pretty much all of my books. The second thing that's super important for me is language. When I was a little kid, we listened to the BBC or we watched the BBC all the time. And I never heard anybody who sounded like me unless it was a TV show where there were paramilitaries on it. So the only association with a Northern Irish accent was terrorism. That's not a terribly positive thing to grow up with. And I didn't want that for the next generation of young people, and many writers in Northern Ireland feel similar. So we're done with writing in clipped, kind of received pronunciation English. A lot of us are going back to the words that we grew up with. For me, it's little bits of Ulster Scots, which is a version of Scots Gaelic that came over with the in my town I grew up in, with the Presbyterians who moved there from Scotland hundreds of years ago. A lot of writers in Belfast are listening to the way people talk on the streets, and they're writing like that in the vernacular, using bits of slang, because writers around the world do that. When you read Arundhati Roy, there are little bits of Indian words and culture in there. When you read some of my favourite writers from Latin America, they are dropping in little bits of Spanish and cultural references and street names. Why should we have to write in a way that doesn't sound like us? It's maddening. And I have particularly started to write not in Belfast language, but in the language of Ballymena, which is the County Antrim rural town that I grew up in. And let me introduce you to a writer who we are getting back into print that you might not have heard of. This is Jan Carson, who was a massive writer from Ballymena in the 70s and early 80s, and unfortunately sustained a brain injury and died quite young. So a lot of his work has fallen out of print. We've now managed to get 2 novels and a short story collection back into print. And Ian wrote almost entirely in rural Ballymena vernacular, and it's brilliant. It's so funny, so rich. It would be a nightmare to translate, but I'm so thankful that there are people like Ian who've gone ahead of me and provided a model for how you write the way you actually talk. And finally, and I'll finish with this and I'll give you a wee short reading before we end. Magical realism is the other kind of third preoccupation in my work. I'm not a realist. I don't know if I'm a magic realist or not anymore. A number of academics have tried to convince me that I'm not ticking all the boxes as a magical realist, but we can have that debate afterwards. For those of you who don't know what magical realism is, a very simple description: it's work which is set in the real world and then strange things happen. So this was a magical realist story. We'd all be trying to stay awake, listening to me, and then Sabine here would start to float around the room, and we'd all wonder what on earth was going on. So strange things happen. These are the heroes that I read as a young person reading magical realism. Günter Grass, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and of course at the top, Salman Rushdie. Midnight's Children is probably the book that's influenced my work the most ever. I basically stole a lot of the fire starters from him. And I love this little quote from C.S. Lewis, who wasn't a magical realist, but I think he got it. The only 2 kinds of talk I wanted were the almost purely imaginative and the almost purely rational. And that's where a lot of my work meets, in that space where I get to use the kind of surreal elements, the strange elements of my work to interrogate what's happening in the kind of socio-political realms in Northern Irish culture. I get to use these weird images to represent something that's difficult to talk about head on in a straightforward way. The Flannery O'Connor, who's my favourite writer who's dead. George Saunders is my favourite not dead writer, and Flannery is my favourite dead writer. And she was asked back in the 50s, why do you use the grotesque in your work, the very dark stuff? And she said, for the hard of hearing, you shout, and for the almost blind, you draw large and startling images. And that quote it's kind of imposed itself over all of my work. People think that they know the story of what happened in Northern Ireland. They think they know the story of what's happening in Northern Ireland now. And sometimes you have to do something to startle them into waking up and looking at it afresh. And for me, that is what the strange surrealist elements do. They make people engage with the text in a very active way. Sometimes they don't like it. They're like, oh, this is mad. I hate this. And I don't mind, because they're thinking, they're wrestling through, what does this mean? How does it impact me? And surely that's what a writer is meant to do, make the readers think, provoke kind of active engagement with the text. That's why I use the kind of surreal elements. We can argue about whether I'm a magic realist or not later, but Marisol probably has some ideas on this. But I'm definitely somebody who's not a realist. And I'm going to finish with just reading you a little bit to illustrate what magical realism is in my work. And then if folks have questions, I am really happy to answer anything. So, all through the fire starters, there are these little sections from the unfortunate children of East Belfast. And the unfortunate children of East Belfast are, you guys know X-Men. Yeah, they're just like really shit X-Men. They have superpowers, but they're all a bit crap. And if you've read Midnight's Children, you will know that I've just nicked that from Salman Rushdie, because the Midnight's Children are all quite similar. They're kids with weird powers that they don't know how to control. I'm going to read you one called The Girl Who Could Only Fall. And this is about a little girl who has wings, but she can't fly. But her parents are absolutely hell-bent on making her fly. And for me, this is an allegory of how a lot of the parents in Northern Ireland see their children. And often it happens around the world as well. If you're a farmer, if you're from a farming family, it doesn't matter whether you want to be a farmer or not, you are going to be a farmer. You know, if you've got lots of people in your family who play music, you are going to piano lessons and you are going to learn how to play the piano, even if you really want to play hockey instead. And I wanted to explore that. How can you, as a parent, can we look at our children and not see their real potential, just try to impose what we want onto them? So I'll finish with this. The Girl Who Could Only Fall. Ella stands barefoot on the branch. She never wears shoes when she's attempting to fly. Her mother insists that she strip right down to her knickers. Now she's older and more self-conscious about the bumps and curves beginning to swell beneath her skin. Ella insists upon something more substantial, a bathing suit or leotard. Her mother agrees, so long as her legs and arms are bare. It's important not to add any extra weight to preserve the impression of lightness. Not that it really matters. Ella could bind herself up with birthday balloons, suck helium straight from the canister, or pump her arms up and down like a racing pigeon, and it would not make the smallest bit of difference. She'd still fall, drop, plummet to earth at a furious rate. Ella wraps her arms around the trunk. She can feel its damp bark grating against her fingertips. Her skin, pressed against the tree's brown, is so white it's almost glowing. There's a purple-blue smudge on her left hip from last week's fall. A pair of pink grazes beginning to crust across her kneecaps. Last week it was a wall. Today it's a tree. They've tried step ladders, climbing frames, even a bridge. Seemingly, there is no end to the high things you can push your daughter off for her own good. Ella looks down and notes the springy green grass circling the tree's trunk. She's grateful for it. There's more give in a lawn. Concrete is not so forgiving. A starling rattled out of the tree's upper branches, goes sweeping past her face. Ella envies its easy flight. As she edges forward, she's careful to keep her elbows tucked in. She can't risk unfurling her wings. They're covered in a thin membrane, like skin but easier torn, and she must avoid loose splinters. She eases out towards the branch's tip, feeling it bow under her weight, curling her feet around its thin curve. Beneath her naked toes, the branch teems with tiny creatures, woodlice, ants, microscopic mini-beasts. They're drawn to Ella and the power that leaks out of her every time she touches. She feels the tickle of them crushing against her skin. She could stay here for hours, she honestly could, but it's not what they want from her. It would be a waste of her wings. "Ready?" shouts her father. "Ready," Ella replies. 12 feet below, he removes the ladder and steps back for a better view. Her mother has the video camera on. Ella unfolds her arms, letting her wings unfurl like pink sails lolloping in the breeze. She bends her knees and pushes off. For the smallest second, she moves upwards. It's only a second, but in this one small moment, Ella always believes. Then gravity grabs her by the ankles and drags her back to earth. She hits the ground rolling. She's taught herself how to lessen the impact. There's only so many times you can fall before you become an expert, and Ella is only good for falling. So I will finish there. And does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Thank you, Jan. This is exactly what we've expected from you. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I'm sure students are interested to know what happens in an author's heart and mind while creating, because we study authors' text in class, but we very rarely have a guided tour into the writer's private world, see how they work, how inspiration comes, their preoccupations, their daily preoccupations, their literary preoccupations, their political preoccupations. So I'm sure our students have questions for you.
And I can answer questions about anything at all. So I was in a high school last week, and the very first question from a 16-year-old was, "Are you a Eurosceptic?" So, I mean, that's the bar. Anywhere above or below that is fine. We got Dominique.
Very silly question, but is it all right to ask you how much say you have on what the BBC will do with your book?
This is a really good question, Dominique.
Oh, thank you.
So it's a production company called Element who are making it as a TV series, and they has anyone read Sally Rooney's work? Mm-hmm. So they also did the 2 adaptations of Sally Rooney's novels, and I have declined I was offered to write it, and I said no. I can't write screenplays, and I'm very, very conscious of knowing your limits, knowing what you're good at and what you're not good at. So a playwright called David Ireland is going to write the TV series. And my attitude for things like this it's important that you ask me this as well. My important attitude to anything, any responses to my work, adaptations, creative collaborations, and translations. So Dominique translated my books into French, and Clara over there is my Spanish translator. They become your piece of art. You know, that we have a saying in Belfast about the Titanic, which we built, and we say, she was fine when she left us. And I feel very similar about my work. I will stand over the books. The books are mine. If they're bad, it's my fault. If they're good, you can heap the praise on me. When somebody begins an adaptation, it becomes their thing. And I've told David, if I don't like it, I'm going to tell you I don't like it. But if it's really brilliant, the praise goes to you. You did that. And I think it comes to the heart of what an artist is. And for me, an artist's job is to serve the art. It's not to serve themselves. So, you know, Bob Dylan always said that Hendrix did a better version of All Along the Watchtower than he did. And he understood that's a cracking song and it should be played as best as possible. And I can't do that, but somebody can do it better than me. So it helps as well with a lot of the reviews and things like that. If you've got that attitude in your head, this is mine. Whoever responds to it, it becomes their thing then. So the French reviews are as much yours as mine.
That's not what that is.
No, I do. I think that's really important. And you know, there are things that make me really angry, like how little translators are honoured when it comes to things like prizes and accolades. And the Dublin Literary Award, they give 50% of the prize money, which is €100,000, so it's not a small amount. 50% of that goes to the translator and 50% goes to the writer. And I think that's the way it should be.
I was more wondering how much of Ireland would the BBC leave in your adaptation?
No, it would be grand because David grew up in Ballybean, which is the housing estate in East Belfast, and Michael, who's producing it, grew up in the bottom of the Newton Ards Road. So I think we'll be fine.
Yeah, I was wondering, Jan, if you have a coffee place where you go in Nancy to write, because you've got this routine of, have you found one in Nancy that inspires you?
It's quite embarrassing.
How do you do that in Nancy?
Yeah, Celine, it's quite embarrassing. I write in Starbucks here. For two reasons. One, the coffee is a lot longer than the much more delicious but very small coffees that you get in most cafes here. And the other reason is I don't mind sitting for 3 hours in a nasty corporate place, taking the table up, but I do feel bad, if it's a nice little bijou coffee shop and there's a line. Did have a triumph this morning. They spelt my name properly for the first time. So I haven't got an E on the end of Jan for the very first time this morning.
I have a question. You've won quite a few literary prizes. Which one is the most important for you, maybe financially, or maybe the one which gave you the most visibility, international visibility, or the one which drew you closer to your readers? Which one?
I'll say two have been really important. I haven't won any, sadly. The ones that I've won are not good money ones, which was a bit annoying, but the 100,000 one would be quite good. The EU Prize for Literature was really important for me because it opened up the door to translations and to travelling around Europe and meeting other writers. But it was also a huge honour because there are 4 books chosen from Ireland to go forward on the shortlist each year by an Irish panel. And the year that I got put forward was just after Brexit, and it was a book about being British in Northern Ireland. And I thought that was really progressive for them to think a book about British identity is allowed to represent Ireland. So it was an honour, and it really kind of reassured me that we might be able to have dialogue in the future. And the other one is the BBC National Short Story Prize is absolutely a wonderful prize, because as well as when you're on the shortlist, I didn't win, you get paid, which is fantastic. They record all of the stories and they go out live on the radio, which is wonderful. And they also produce a really gorgeous little anthology that you can buy in the shops of the 5 stories that are shortlisted. And of my year, the 5 that were on it, a couple of the people I've become really good friends with. So one of them is in my anthology, my dementia anthology now. So I really enjoyed that one too.
Okay, thank you so much, Jan. You told us about your sources of inspiration, both dead and alive. And when you mentioned Salman Rushdie and Midnight Children in particular, you said, I stole a lot from him. So that's an avowal of a conscious case of plagiarism. Can you tell us a little bit more about that process of, borrowing, referring to?
Do you know, I think there's a lot of academics in the room. I'll not make you put your hands up and shame yourselves, but there are academics in the room. And I think a lot of the process of writing is subconscious. You don't really know what you're doing, except you've fallen in love with a character and you're trying to tell their story. And then this lovely lot who are much more intelligent and better read than us come along and tell us all the clever things that we've done. And it was an academic that pointed out first, that's very similar to Midnight's Children. Midnight's Children explores themes of partition in Ireland, about the how it's impacted the next generation of young people. It has a supernatural element. It's in places very, very difficult to read, but also quite funny, as is hopefully the Firestarters is all those things. I didn't consciously set out to do that, but there are texts buried in the back of your head, as there are experiences and people that you've met. And I always say that I think it's bollocks when writers say that they haven't written about real life. How could you not write about real life? Like, the only experiences that we have to draw on, the only building blocks we have when we come to create a piece of art are what we've experienced, whether that be lived experience or things you've read or things you've watched in the cinema. You can't just, to say that you're not writing about anything real or real people is like saying you've invented a new colour. It's just impossible. So there's a lot, like all my work is a mishmash of what I've lived through and what I've seen and what I've read. was actually, I'll just say one more thing about this. I don't know if anyone saw, and I've forgotten the chap's name, and I'm dying to read it, but the guy who won the Booker Prize this year, and one of the first things he said was, "I completely ripped off Kurt Vonnegut." And I just thought that is so refreshing and so honest for him to go, "I've been a lifelong Vonnegut fan, and there's so much of his influence on this book." And it's very honouring to the writers who've come before as well.
Yeah, hi. I was interested in what you were saying about the literary tradition that you see yourself as coming out of in the Irish context. And there were various different things that you said about it at different stages. And one was about the sense that in the current form, at least, that there was a strongly nationalist tendency and that there's a new, different set of possibilities. But when you were looking at the longer time frame and mentioning some of the sort of obvious Irish tradition, I think that actually quite a disproportionate number of those were in fact Protestant, weren't they? Yeah. And there's the extra angle of complication in there, which is the difference between Church of Ireland Protestants and Presbyterian Protestants. So I mean, there's
and the 45 other denominations as well.
Right, yes. And well, so I suppose I was just wondering if there's a bit more to say about the way that those different complexities shape up together, and what's happened to make the nationalist version of Irishness come more to the fore in the 20th century, I suppose, than what it had been in the past, and what's the Presbyterian role part in that story?
Yeah. I mean, I'll say one word, what happened in the 20th century, and that one word is Hollywood. So, you know, there's a lot of the American emphasis. I mean, it's super interesting to me. Kenneth Branagh's Belfast, which is a terrible film, but important because that's the first major Hollywood exploration of Protestant identity that America actually bought and went for. You know, the history of Hollywood and Ireland is predominantly a Catholic history, and it's understandable as well. And it's also, you know, understandable but problematic that if you go back, you know, 150 years, there's lots of big house novels and there's lots of, you know, Protestant supremacy novels and things. I think what is happening is it's much more complex than just those traditional sectarian binaryisms. It's an opening up of all the voices. So, you know, I got a text or an email last night from an academic who was looking for representation of gay paramilitaries in literature from Northern Ireland. And we had a laugh. But, I mean, it's also, that's a genuine question. Like, you know, the LGBTQ plus narrative, it wasn't there until very recently. The, you know, working class voices were suppressed, women's voices were suppressed. So I think it's not just that, you know, there was an absence of anything but nationalism, or for a while there was an absence of anything but unionism for a while. It's where were all of the complex kind of smorgasbord of voices that we needed to hear. And it is, you know, I don't want to mention the idea of a border poll in any kind of serious way, but there is the possibility in the next not too far distant future of big questions about the future of Ireland and unification. And if our art and culture isn't representing the entire range of experiences on the island, we're going to vote like we voted in Brexit with, you know, from a place of ignorance, not really understanding the implications and the repercussions. So I think there's a lot of that's tied up in why there's been this opening out of literature. There's also, you know, I think we're up to about 8% of people in Northern Ireland are now from a different ethnic background to what I grew up with. They deserve to have a voice and to have their experiences heard. And we're starting to see that in literature as well. So it's becoming more complex, more diverse, and I think more interesting. I can't really speak with any kind of, was raised Presbyterian, but I'm not too sure about Presbyterians in literature apart from December Bride, which I love.
Hi Jan, so as I said to you earlier, my name is Teresa, I'm from the Republic of Ireland, and just two comments. The first one is that I think it's great, even though you said that Irish nationalism was, you know, written about a lot My experience in Europe was, you know, if I told someone, yes, I come from the south of Ireland, from the Republic of Ireland, and we speak a little bit further, and I tell them, yes, my father was in the army, and said, what, the Irish Republican Army? You know, so people still don't understand the IRA and the difference in the Irish Army. So I do think it's great that there's, you know, they still need, you know, to continue and explain. I think even Irish people aren't even fully aware of what went on in Ireland, what went on in the north of Ireland, and I was only a few kilometres from Belfast. So your writing does help develop all of that information. The second thing I just wanted to say was, when we come from the south, my mother came from the north of Ireland, and we used to love it when our relatives came because we love their accent. So if there's one thing that I prefer to even reading you, is actually listening to you. I love this Belfast accent. I think that really helps, you know, when you're speaking about, you know, how you bring this accent, and it's fantastic to hear you. Thank you.
I mean, it's one of the things I think it's quite hard for French people to understand, because from what I can hear from talking to you guys, there's not the same kind of regional diversity in accents here. There is at least 9 distinct accents in Northern Ireland alone. So what you're getting from me is not a Belfast accent, it's a Ballymena accent. It has like little shades of Scottish in it, which you can probably pick up. Bizarrely sounds very similar to a Kilkeel accent. So there must have been a lot of Scottish people moved to Kilkeel as well. But the accents, the regional diversity in accents, and even word choice. I'll finish with this because I know we have to get on to other people. One of the worst things that I did last year, I'm a very lazy researcher, and if we've got a question about Northern Irish culture, I just tend to put it on Twitter and hope that somebody will give me the answer. Just very lazy, don't do that. And in Ireland, or in Northern Ireland, whenever you vomit, you know, throw up, bleh, the word for it is boke. So you say, oh, I just boked. Because it's not the same in England, sure it's not, Ben? No. So even like in our house, we had the bowl that you throw up in when you're sick, and it was called the boke bowl. So do you have that in the south, Teresa? Anyway, so I stupidly put up on Twitter, how would you go about spelling the word boke? And then I got over 130 responses that were just the word boke spelled differently. So every time I looked at my phone, it was just boke, 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 boke. But there were 3 or 4 different spellings of just that one syllable word. So you get kind of regional diversity across Northern Ireland. Yeah, Ben?
It sounds similar to puke.
Yeah. I think we decided the official canonical spelling of it was B-O-K-E, but one person spelt it B-O-Q-U-E, which the response to that was that that's just bugging with notions, which I thought was really wonderful.
Okay, yes, I will thank you, Jan, for your presentation. It was wonderful. I have a question about the reception of your work in Northern Ireland, because I've been following and tracing our reviews, and everything is positive. And I was just wondering whether you think that as part of that progressive culture that is starting to kind of appear in Northern Ireland, because one of the most important things that you mentioned is the fact that before your work, the narrative in Northern Ireland was nationalist, and all of them very male. But you open the ideas and the culture to other possibilities, and you are not from the side of the victims. So I was wondering, but I haven't found any negative.
I'll send you one or two, Marisol. No, there's a few.
So I was just wondering, you know, within Northern Ireland, how your work is being read, and mainly from the Catholic side.
Do you know, it's been gorgeous. I've had such a wonderful response from the Catholic nationalist community. A real kind of, in the north, but also in the south as well, a real kind of, this is a world that we don't know enough about and we want to learn. And real open dialogue, you know, particularly around the religious stuff. So I've been in places like I can say this because we're not in Northern Ireland, but the Raptures is set in a fictional village called Ballylack, but it's actually Kells in the north, where I grew up. But we'll not tell that to anybody in Northern Ireland. But there's also a Kells in the south, which is the opposite. So our Kells has everything that doesn't move is painted red, white and blue. And the other Kells, when you go into it, there's a big statue of Mary in a box as you come into the village. I always think somebody who's creative should twin the two of them because it would be really funny. But I did an event down there and they asked so many questions. Why do you do that? And what goes on in a service when you're doing that? And it was so healthy, and we should have been doing that kind of stuff like 30, 40 years ago, because that's where a lot of the fear comes from, not being able to say, I don't know what you do in your church. Are you actually sacrificing children in there? Or is that just what they're telling me? And if you can begin with a place of kind of respect and community to ask those questions, they're not intrusive, they're not meant to be offensive, it's just learning. So I'm happy to keep having those conversations if it means that we know a wee bit more about each other. I hope that.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for your questions. Let's thank Jan again.